Further, I am now joining you on the side of the battle and will explain to those who still do not want to see the blatant truth why Dragon Ball Canon is dead. Now obviously, if we want to be literal, the only real Dragon Ball Canon that truly exists is the original Dragon Ball manga, but even that, you'll find out later on the video, has its own contradictions that we can discuss. But to begin, we will start off with why Dragon Ball Z is not canon. And to be completely honest with you, it's just because the anime filler and the anime itself took various different directions with many aspects of the Dragon Ball story that just don't tie into the original manga. For example, we have the Otherworld Tournament, which is a filler arc. Now, you can say, oh well, that's just filler, and you can say that, but you also have to factor in that it starts mixing in canon events within the filler itself. For example, if we go to the fight dealing with Kid Buu, he had a moment where he went to the other world and met up with Pikkon and Olibu very briefly before going back to fight against Goku and Vegeta. Now, why is this a problem? Well, technically this is an issue because the main villain of that particular arc directly met characters that never existed in the manga itself. So that major contradiction is something that we can just look off at the side, but at the same time, it directly contradicts what originally happened in the original story. And then we also have to talk about the concept of hell. The concept of hell was never really explained at all, and I will admit that I do like that the anime did expand on hell as a concept where you can see like the villains in the background and stuff, but hell itself was just never explained. We just assumed that bad villains went there and that was effectively it. And then when we look at other minor things like Gregory, the cricket that hangs out with King Kai, existing in the anime variation but not existing in the manga, but then also existing in Dragon Ball Super but not existing in Battle of Gods, you see where we're coming with this, where like characters sometimes exist in certain variations but then they don't exist in other variations, you know? And that is a huge reason as to why the Dragon Ball Z anime just simply can't be canon. And then when we move on to the Dragon Ball movies, we have things where it's pretty obvious because the movies kind of have like their own like what if time placements that the movies can't be canon. But I will give that, at least when it comes to the Dragon Ball Z anime, there are two movies that you can say would be canon to the Dragon Ball Z anime, and if these movies were in the manga, they could kind of fit with BoJack Unbound and Wrath of the Dragon, because those movies fit in perfectly with the original Dragon Ball storyline to the point where, like, there really are no real contradictions at all with those movies, and they can fit perfectly into the Dragon Ball continuity in both the manga and the anime if it was written to be that way. But it's extremely important that we mention two other characters in Broly and Kale. Broly was originally a movie villain in the Dragon Ball Z anime movies that became canonized into the Dragon Ball Super anime, and he's even mentioned in the manga. And when we look at Kale, she's basically just a female version of Broly. So then you would get the question of, well, if you start canonizing movie characters, and when you start canonizing the concept of the legendary Super Saiyan, at what point do you draw the line of what you would consider canon when you can just mix and match between movies being canon and not? And then you have the Super movies that are canon to the Super universe, but they also tie into the Super anime, but then Battle of Gods: The Resurrection F don't. So effectively you have a situation where the Dragon Ball Super movies kinda also have like their own category of trying to follow the anime, which was something that we'd never really seen before in Dragon Ball. And then we also have something like Dragon Ball Specials. First would be Bardock, the father of Goku. Now, why is this really important? Well, what we have to understand about Bardock, the father of Goku, is that prior to us knowing more about Bardock later on with Dragon Ball Minus and all those changes, even though it wasn't quote-unquote canon because Toriyama effectively added Bardock into the manga as kind of like a side note reference to what the TV special actually was, Bardock, the father of Goku, was what we considered canon because we simply just didn't have anything else of him. But when we actually look at the changes that have taken place with his story, there are some things that stayed the same, like, you know, Bardock having his final battle against Frieza where he shot like that, you know, energy blast towards him that they kept in Dragon Ball Super, and, you know, they try to keep some things consistent with Dragon Ball Minus, but effectively Bardock, the father of Goku, is his own story, but at the time it did feel canon, and anybody who grew up in that era knew that. And then we also have the history of Trunks, which is also a really interesting thing because the history of Trunks did technically exist in the manga through the form of the Trunks the Lone Warrior manga chapter, And in this chapter, basically the same general things happened like we talked about in Dragon Ball Z, but there were some differences of like Gohan being a lot stronger, and then also the fact that Trunks learned how to become a Super Saiyan after Gohan died, when in fact Trunks already knew how to go Super Saiyan before Gohan died, and that's a major thing that I don't think we can just glance at, because one story is saying that Gohan's death triggered him to become a Super Saiyan, one story is saying he already knew it, and Gohan was strong enough to fight against Trunks in his base form with one arm. So two different things are depicting completely different power scales and a major character transformation. And then we also have another special that we should mention called Yosun Goku and His Friends Return. Now, it effectively said that Vegeta had a brother even though there was never any mention of Saiyans existing beforehand, outside of the ones that we had already known. So when that happens, we kind of just accept it, but we don't look at Yosun Goku and His Friends Return as actual canon until we find out that in Battle of Gods, he was briefly mentioned. So now you're getting into a situation where Tarbell is mentioned in Battle of Gods, but he's not mentioned in Super. So it's like, well, does he exist? If you look at the movie Dragon Ball Super Broly, he was mentioned, but when he was talking about Planet Vegeta exploding and whether or not he actually survived. So technically that would mean that since he's canon to Battle of Gods, and since he's technically canon to Dragon Ball Super, even though he was never shown or referenced in the Super anime, but the movie, because the movie's canon to the anime, then technically Tarbell is canon. But then the question now comes, well, is he truly canon because he wasn't canon to the original manga? You see where we're going with this. Does Vegeta really have a brother? And then when we move on to Dragon Ball GT, when you look at Dragon Ball GT, effectively it's not really canon because Toriyama basically said that it's effectively a side story, and I'm showing you the quote on the screen right now so you can see that. Now when we move on to Dragon Ball Super, the reason why Super can't be canon is because it directly contradicts both the manga and the Dragon Ball Z anime. So if the Dragon Ball Z anime isn't canon, as we already explained before, then that effectively means that the manga can't tie into Super either because of the changes that Super made. But basically, with Super coming back, if it goes beyond the time period that was the end of Z and would go into the time period that would be GT, specifically not saying that GT's canon, but saying that it would go into the time period that GT was held in place, then effectively at that point, since Super would be going beyond the end of Z, it would effectively be creating its own universe with changes that wouldn't completely tie into what the original manga and even the original anime was supposed to have, with characters behaving different, transformations not existing, certain characters not fighting for several years, Bulma not seeing Goku. All of those things would be completely confirmed because we can still try and wink and act like they don't exist even though the consistencies are pretty blatant in our face. But once it goes past the 10-year time skip, there's nothing we could do to try and salvage Super tying into the end of Z. You know, and one of the things about Dragon Ball Super is that because it's effectively in this box of time where it's after the defeat of Buu, but again, before the end of Z, there's always going to be some problems there with characters not aging and so on and so forth. And effectively, if you want to put characters in that timeline, this is just what's going to happen. Things are just not going to completely tie up, but if you want to tell a story, and you want to tell the story in this time period, you're going to have to just glance over things that are just inconsistent. And then we get into another interesting situation with Jaco the Galactic Patrolman. Now, out of all of the major points that we've made so far in this video, this is by far the most complex. Because Jaco the Galactic Patrolman shows that Bulma had a sister who was never mentioned in the original Dragon Ball manga and the Dragon Ball Z anime, but obviously we can just wink it off and say, well, maybe Bulma did have a sister, but the problem with this is that Bulma was shocked to see about Goku being an alien and the concept of aliens in the Dragon Ball universe, but that wouldn't make sense because in Jaco the Galactic Patrolman, Bulma's had direct contact with aliens, so that one detail directly contradicts some things that we've seen before in Dragon Ball history. And when we look at it from that perspective, is Jaco the Galactic Patrolman effectively canon? I want you guys to actually answer that because it's technically from Toriyama, but it's changing things that were in the original manga, similar to what happened in Dragon Ball Midas, which was a segment of Jocko the Galactic Patrolman. So, for all sakes and purposes, it's probably best that we just basically say that Jocko the Galactic Patrolman is like revised, modernized canon that Toriyama changed from the original story, but it can't be original canon because of the original things that it changed. And then last but not least, guys, we have to talk about video game canon, which we will use as a metaphor to describe everything. When you're creating a video game, you want to tell the story of a video game. You have to design the video game in a way that it would be fun for the players to play, and it would create interesting storylines that may not be completely original, but are designed in a video game-like way. And the way that we can use this is that in various video games like Fighters, Dragon Ball Xenoverse, Dragon Ball Xenoverse 2, Dragon Ball Xenoverse 3, which will eventually come out in 200 years, well, we look at those video games combined with various other Dragon Ball video games that have taken liberties like making Vegeta a Super Saiyan 3, or, having a Super Saiyan 3 Broly, all of these different things that we've had in the past. All of this couldn't be canon, but it's fun for a game. And I think the way that we look at video games is that we should look at it the same way that we look at Dragon Ball Canon, where effectively the story wants to go in the direction that it wants to go, and if we try to follow all of these canon rules, we can't tell the story. Now, alternatively, an alternate way that we could look at the current state of Dragon Ball Canon is to compare it to Dragon Ball Heroes, which is clearly not canon, and does not try to be canon, as it combines various different Dragon Ball concepts and themes from different universes, and essentially meshes them in one. But the interesting thing about this is that Dragon Ball Heroes doesn't care, and neither does the Dragon Ball anime and the Dragon Ball manga at this point, because now the Dragon Ball anime and the Dragon Ball manga don't care, and essentially just mix things whenever they feel like it, just because they want to tell the story in that direction. So when you get to the point that we're using Dragon Ball Heroes as an example to prove that the current state of Dragon Ball is not canon, as Dragon Ball fans we should just accept that Dragon Ball Canon is dead.